hydroelectrics. Hydroelectrics, about 28 grams, 24 grams. Solar is about 28 grams, biomass 220, so on and so forth. There have been some advancements with fossil fuel burning with carbon capture, allowing to lower the amount released through that. What is going on? In 2019, the US had about 51 billion metric tons of CO2 released, for the most part through the burning of fossil fuels. And a large portion of decommissioned wind turbines and solar panels aren't able to be recycled. So on top of the emissions of CO2 caused by their infrastructure being built, they're not able to be recycled as some other forms of material. Energy density and energy production, like CO2 emissions, there's a land cost to every source of energy production. As energy density increases, the land affected gets smaller for the most part. With nuclear, you're going to use up about, for 1 kilometer squared, you're going to produce upwards of 3,300 gigawatts per gigawatt hours. Solar onshore 872, offshore 222, solar is 48, and with biomass, because biomass is using so much land to produce, say, ethanol through corn, it takes a lot of land use and doesn't produce as much with the energy that goes into it. So what's nature's role in all this? Nature naturally has CO2 available in the atmosphere and is used by plants for respiration. All plants take in that CO2, produce all their structures and all the sugars. And above and below the ground surface, plants and microbes bind carbon from CO2. The largest natural binding entity on the planet are temperate forest trees. So the annual rise in atmospheric CO2 for the US has been about 3 billion metric tons less than what is released, which suggests that there is an actual large natural sink. So my problem, US emissions have been dropping since our peak in 2007. Throughout the world, especially in the developing nations, we have been actively driving to reduce our CO2 emissions. We've stopped deforestation for the most part. We're developing carbon capture, developed wind turbines, solar panels, refined nuclear power. Underdeveloped countries, on the other hand, have much less active role in reducing CO2 emissions, because they actively are cutting down forests to grow agriculture, to use the wood for heat, for cooking. If they do have a reliable source of energy, it's almost always a fossil fuel or wood. So they're releasing CO2 in abundance. The global trade of CO2 through the ICPP is not a complete remedy. It helps, but it kind of, I see that it's kind of just kicking the can down the road. It allows the heavy CO2 producers like China and India to trade away the emissions they use to countries more like the US, where we've actually lowered our emissions a considerable amount. So I feel the active removal of CO2 needs to be near the top of the list of what we need to do when it comes to CO2 and climate change. There's a secondary issue that comes along with the renewable energies because of their large land use. There's an urban heat island effect, where 70% of the world by 2050 is going to be living in urban areas, producing this urban heat island effect. With the growing land use attributes being changed for solar and wind are adding to that effect. It's yet to be seen how detrimental that is added to the urban heat islands, but it's still a possibility. So sequestration, removing, trapping CO2 from the atmosphere. Temperate trees or temperate forests, as I said earlier, is the largest CO2 sink that is on the planet. A mature temperate forest tree can sequester 21.77 kilograms per year of CO2. 1 acre of temperate forest can hold upwards of 5,000 trees and can grow a full, healthy, mature stand of 900 trees, each sequestering that 21.77 kilograms per year once they're mature. There was a temperate forest study done on the temperate forests in Australia that indicated that there was between 53 and 70 metric tons of carbon can be sequestered per year per acre. And according to the agricultural census, between 2012 and 2017, approximately 14.3 million acres of farmland had been retired and was no longer being used for production of crops, basically left to its own devices. That would allow for a potential of reforestation, at least in the Northeast, where the historic temperate forests were before the settling from the Europeans. So my proposed GIS study for reforestation and afforestation, with energy density and CO2 sequestration, may be the key to the greenhouse effect, slowing it down or possibly even reversing it if we can do enough. Reforestation can do more than just reduce CO2 emissions. Changing the energy sources that we use obviously can reduce CO2 if we remove fossil fuels, but reducing or removing are two different elements. The actual temperate forests can remove more CO2 than just reducing. So I suggest that there's a shift in the focus from just lowering emissions with solar and wind and other low emissions, and less dense energy, but adding in sequestration. So I want to use the GIS to determine where we can plan to reforest or afforestation. I can use the U.S. Geological Survey's land use to determine where retired agricultural land, pastures, and unused or undeveloped land is. Using that, I can determine where and how much trees we can plant on that unused, historically forested land. Through the excuse me, through the Energy Information Administration, I can find and plot where all the solar and or wind turbine power production is, with those as they are decommissioned and we move towards more dense energy, we can reforest the lands that had trees removed to put up the turbines. I can use these images or these maps to calculate the amount of CO2 that can be potentially sequestered by the trees on the retired farmland, and how much energy can, or how much CO2 can be reduced or removed on these plots where renewable energy has been placed. So I can determine how much CO2 emissions potentially over the life cycle of these low emissions sources is produced, and how much CO2 can be removed, and determine whether or not the amount of degradation to the environment for these energy sources offsets enough. With these calculations, I can determine the potential for removing enough CO2 to forego these low density energy sources that cause other high impact environmental degradation. Like with the wind turbines, hundreds of thousands of birds and bats are killed by the blades every year. I mean, is the detriment to the environment offset enough just by the CO2 reduction for this energy source? So there are other forms of low emissions energy that we can produce high energy without as much damage to the environment, like run of river hydroelectric power, where you're not producing a dam and the water doesn't fill up a huge reservoir to make the potential energy for the hydroelectric. It actually diverts just a small portion of the river and puts that water back in the river downstream after it goes through a turbine. Nuclear power, which has, it's got its own demons, but it is a very high dense energy source and a very low CO2 emissions source. And with carbon capture, with our fossil fuels and carbon recycling, we can lower emissions and still use some fossil fuels while we're producing these reforested areas. With advancements that we've seen recently with these higher density, lower impact energy sources, is it feasible to move more towards them and away from these low density, large area, especially with the recent MIT development of a 20 Tesla superconductor magnet. They're on the verge of actually producing the first net gain fusion reactor. With fusion reactions, nuclear would be a whole different animal. So that's my plan, is to determine where and how much reforestation and trees we can remove CO2 from the environment, from our atmosphere from.
All right, great job, Chris.
Thank you. I really felt like I was rushing and I was trying to slow myself down.
You did great with time, so no worries there. While people are getting their questions prepared, I have a quick question for you. You mentioned that one of your, or the approach that you're going to take is look at reforestation. Mm-hmm. As part of your project, have you thought at all about including costs associated with the reforestation? Ultimately, someone has to pay for this.
Yes. Yeah, and it's there's a lot more information that I wanted to use, and I felt that I had to curb how much research I was doing, because I was getting so buried in information that I had to cut back a little bit, but definitely the cost of the venture is definitely a point of contention that needs to be looked at.
It looks like you have a question in the chat window.
I was trying to figure out how to leave the sharing.
You should be able to go to the share screen and just use the click and stop share. Should be probably at the top of the window under view
There it is,
options.
I found it. All right.
There you go.
Okay. Area of interest. The area that I'm looking at for context, I was looking mainly in the Northeast. I'd like to do the whole US, but that is a whole other animal that I don't know if I have the strength to take on. So I've definitely been kind of focusing towards the Northeast.
All right, do we have any other questions for Chris?
Thank you, Shannon.
I guess I have a question. Should I type it or should I ask it?
Well, since you're already speaking, go ahead. Yep.
I figured. My question is, so for your analysis, is this, are you doing like by acres? Do you have some sort of like multiplier that you're going to use to understand how much CO2 you're taking out with these trees?
Yeah, so I have information on how much CO2 sequestration mature trees take in, and using the GIS land use data, I can determine within reason the amount of acreage that is available for reforestation in the historic forested areas. And planting trees, it can take years to mature. But I mean, the first few years, for about 10 years, really, the trees aren't going to be considered mature, and they wouldn't take as much CO2 out. But once they're mature, it'd be the full amount that I would be estimating.
Okay, so I guess you're going to be like your results will be assumed that they are mature trees.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's a couple of articles that have been posted for me. I'm going to check them out later. Any more questions?
All right, I think we're ready to move on to our next presenter. Lindsay, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, I will be on that. Let's see here. I take it my screen is sharing. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry that my desktop is pretty chaotic. Kind of matches the way my brain is sometimes. So should I just dive straight into it, or are we going to wait until 7?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Normally what we've done is we've just sort of kept right on going. So if you're okay with that, we can proceed.
I am a-okay with that. Okay, so I think it's an interesting that we started discussing kind of energy options and CO2, and my project actually relates to a source of renewable energy, so it's a nice segue. So my project is going to be understanding kind of the landscape response to some of these hydro facilities. So the Vernon Dam and the Northfield Mountain Pumping Station that are on the Connecticut River. And this project was done in partnership with the Connecticut River Conservancy. I actually reached out to them looking to see if they had any GIS tasks that they needed. And this actually fit right up with my interests in my first master's, which was with river science. So the quantifying geomorphic responses, understanding what kind of volumetric landscape has happened along the banks of the river. And so to lie a little bit of background information down, we already were kind of mentioning how hydroelectric power is one of our renewable energy resources. And it's actually the most common renewable energy, especially historically speaking. It was one of the first sources of electricity generation. And up until 2019, it was actually the largest source of annual US renewable energy generation. And so you can see in this graph that's provided by the US Energy Information Administration that there's actually been a decline in use of hydro facilities over the past few decades. And that's actually nothing to be of concern, because these are all of our general metrics for where the US sources most of its electricity. And as you can see with this green, renewables are right up there with petroleum and other fossil fuels. So it's definitely on the rise. And so it's nothing to be concerned with my project when I talk about decreasing the use of hydroelectric, but it's mainly fallen to the wayside due to more efficient processes like what we've mentioned with wind and solar and others like that. So that's kind of, where we're at with our renewable sources. So I've mentioned this decline, and you might be wondering, why is there a bit of decline? And just like what Chris meant, I hope that's your name, just mentioned in his, that there can be a lot of landscape impact, especially with those they're going to be called hydro peaking. I'll explain them more, but the ones where they kind of flood up the reservoir behind it, you can see in this image that there's many different impacts that hydro facilities will have on the surrounding environment. And in this project, mainly we're just going to be focusing on riverbank erosion, a little bit of sedimentation, and also some of licensing issues, because that's kind of the driving force of this project. So I mentioned I was going to give us a little bit of background information on our dams that we're discussing. So in this study area, which I'll go over shortly, we actually have two types of hydroelectric facilities. One of them is the classic hydroelectric power dam, as you can see in this figure. And what we're going to focus on is we have these sluice gates, which allow water to pass through. And so Chris even mentioned there's the run of the river technique, which is the one that has a lower impact. So this is when the sluice gates are left open, the flow goes through that penstock, moves that turbine, and flows out through that downstream outlet. And it's kind of just the same type of current that you'd expect from the river. The one that causes a little more damage, kind of as Chris had mentioned, is ones that are known as hydro peaking. So hydro peaking systems have those sluice gates closed for most of the time when energy costs are high or are low, or demands are low. And so they use that to kind of build that up. And then when energy costs or demands are high, they open the gates, the classic open the floodgates type of saying, and send that through that penstock to generate a much greater force on that turbine to generate more electricity. And so the one that we'll be discussing today is known as the Vernon Dam, and we'll get to that shortly. There's also kind of a difficulty with this type, in addition to flooding out the land, is there's a lot of silt or fine sediment that builds up before this dam. And that is the primary reason why there's been a lot of decline with a lot of the dams, is they just get clogged up with all that silt that's directly upstream. So the other type of facility that I'm going to be discussing today is something that's known as a pumped storage facility. And the way that these work is it's exchanging water between two reservoirs. So you can see in this figure, there's a lower reservoir, and then in the higher elevations, there's an upper reservoir. And the way that electricity is generated is when energy demands and costs are low, their water will be pumped uphill from the lower reservoir. And as that water is being pumped, it runs through the turbines and generates electricity, and then it will be stored in the reservoir. When energy demands are high or expensive, then the gates from the upper reservoir will be released, and gravity will aid water coming down those hills and going through those turbines. And so it sounds good in theory, but there have been some kind of observations through the U.S. Energy Info Administration that have mentioned that some of these systems may use more electricity to pump that water uphill than they produce. And the other kind of downside to that is that energy is usually through fossil fuels, sometimes nuclear plants, and it's not helpful to be using energy in order to generate it. And so today we'll be discussing the Northfield Mountain Pumped Storage Station. And there's a whole added kind of concern to this in that it uses the Connecticut River as its lower reservoir. It doesn't have a contained man-made reservoir. And so you can imagine that when they're pumping this water from its lower reservoir, the Connecticut River, it causes the water depth to decrease. And then when they decide to release the water down the hill, down Northfield Mountain, it causes the water depth to increase. And so this is this constant exchange between making the water lower and then forcing the water to go higher. And it goes back and forth. And if you look at, there's a river gauge that's just upstream of it, which I should have included a picture of. And you can see even daily, the river levels are going up and down constantly. And that will kind of play into some of our discussions we'll have in a few slides. And so one thing, again, I have to give the plug of our partner, the Connecticut River Conservancy wants to be a partner of the river. It wants to stand between, anything that may be harming it and doing whatever they can to help it. And so in this image, you can see a lot of their goals. And that first box is kind of the best way to describe it. They're keeping watch to protect the Connecticut River. And so they do lots of other projects. They do annual river cleanups, which I always participate in. That's how I learned about them. But you can see in that last box that hydropower is a major focus for them. And so in this discussion, we're going to be seeing what can they do to help this cleaner and greener hydropower. And so before we go into that, we're going to discuss a little bit about who they're working with. So there's the Department of Energy has this group known as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And what they do is they do a lot for energy, but precisely with hydropower, one of the things they do is they develop licenses for all of these facilities. And so these licenses can often last between 30 to 50 years before they have to be renewed. And so the Connecticut River Conservancy describes these as a contract between the people and the hydropower facilities. And so in this process of relicensing, people are allowed to give the opportunity to voice their concerns. And this is something that the Connecticut River Conservancy takes a large role in assisting. And so this project is something that's actually going to help with some relicensing that's about to happen. So in my study area, like I mentioned, we have the Vernon Dam and the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station. And in the center figure, you can see these are the 5 dams or hydro facilities that are up for relicensing. And so we chose to do these 2, mainly because they may be working with or against each other with these impacts. And also there's an interesting story to be told in this reach of river. My contacts in the Connecticut River Conservancy actually described this area of the river as just quote unquote weird. So of course I decided I want to dive in and try to understand some of the things that are going on with it. So there's I'm going to go back up a slide. You can see here, there are actually dozens of hydro facilities along the Connecticut River. And so this is 324 miles of the 410 miles of the Connecticut River have been impacted by these hydro facilities. So that's why we're working to understand and develop licenses that can allow these hydro facilities to make a contract they're going to be doing the river a justice as opposed to something that may be harming it. And so I'll give you a little background about the first dam that we're looking at, and that's the Vernon Dam. They began construction in 1907 and operation in 1909, according to the Brattleboro Historical Society. This is operated by the Great River Hydro Company, and it's capable of producing 32,400 kilowatts of energy. And so this is run of the river at times, but there are times where it's still functioning as a hydro peaking facility. And so let's have some topo maps here. These are 3 different topo maps of the same area, roughly the same scale, of showing before the dam was constructed using this 1893 image, and then close to after it was constructed, 1932. And then I just also have one for today, kind of to give you guys a view of how much this landscape has changed. You can see the river's always kind of had this L-shaped curve to it. And it's always had those 2 islands kind of immediately downstream of the dam. Let me, I'll use my little pointer to show you the dam right here. That's where it's located. You can also see it here. Don't know what this triangle is, but it's there. So you can see we've always kind of had these 2 islands, and they've kind of changed over time. We're well aware that this historical topo map may not be scientifically as accurate as the 2015 LiDAR imagery that we're going to use for the modern example of this project, but we're using it basically as a proxy. We can't have the LiDAR for these first 2, but I'm going to explain how we can use this to understand it. Before we go much further in discussing these dams, I'm going to lay a little bit of background down about river science. So tapping into my other masters. So when you go around a bend in a river, basics like centrifugal force, the outside of the bend is going to have a faster flow than the inside of the bend. The faster flow is going to cause more erosion, and that's something that's known as a cut bank. The inner flow, since it can't keep up with the faster flow, is going to allow for some deposition of sediment. So this deposited sediment can form these little bands or something that's known as a point bar. And so this is the driving force of something you may have heard of, which is called meandering rivers. So you can see in this photo to the right, we kind of have a river meandering everywhere about. And so these meanders change their location due to the conveyor belt system of this eroding and deposition. So you can see at one point the river used to be here and it was eroding in this direction, and the point bar was kind of depositing right behind it. But there was a time where this loop kind of got cut off. And I'm going to go to our site at Vernon Dam. I'm going to go to this one. And so you can see here we have a bend. Even though this is the reservoir upstream of the dam, we still have a flow that's directed in this direction. And also right here, we have a bend, which is directed in this direction. When you have 2 cut banks that are working towards each other, they form a landform known as a neck. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here. And the big concern is when a neck gets thin enough and 2 cut banks work close enough to each other, they can actually be breached. And so the concern here is if this neck breaches, not only is it going to make the hydro facility pointless, because the river likes to take the path of least resistance, it also threatens the habitat of a protected species known as the rose toad. So this is Stebbins Island right here. And sorry, didn't mean to go that way. This is Stebbins Island right here. And if we have a breach through this neck, it's going to overflow Stebbins Island and threaten our rose toad's home. So that's a biota concern for this. Another area of erosion that you might be seeing in this image is directly downstream from the dam itself. And FERC has actually done some studies in this area to try to understand just how much erosion is occurring. And so why is that much erosion occurring right there? This is a photograph from 2016 of right where this yellow box is. The primary cause of this is going to be these bank materials, which I'll dive into a little in the next slide. But you can see that's very loosely deposited sand. And so the river is having a grand old time just eroding that away. And so the study that I mentioned is again, just for reference, this yellow box is pretty much exactly the figure I'm about to show you. The study from 2012 shows that these colorful lines that you see right here along the bottom of the figure are the top, where the trees are growing. And then this black dashed line is right down where the water starts. And within this study that they've been using survey data for, there's a green line right here that's from 2003. And there's a black line right here that's from 2012. So if you use this scale, you can see that the riverbank has migrated about 40 feet south in a decade. So this is a pretty rapid rate when you're looking at geomorphic change or landscape change. So this is something that FERC has been keeping its eye on, and it's really helpful to have kind of a baseline study in our area. So I mentioned these bank materials, and in this figure on the upper right, this is that neck that I was mentioning, excuse me, in that bend in the river. This S stands for sand. So it just kind of proves it's been mapped. We have a lot of sand in this area. And this is another image that was taken a bit upstream of it. And on this topic of this easily to erode sand, there's actually been a lot of concerns that have been raised by property owners and farmers along the area. I'm not going to have the sound on this video because when I tested it, it didn't really work out too well to travel through Zoom. Let me turn this off, but I can show this to you just to have some video look at what we're seeing here. So this man right here is a farmer who has 3/4 of a mile along the river. And they've lived there since the 1960s, and they've lost 40 feet of land just from this bank slumping down. So you can see all these photos showing it. And here he's also talking about some low-lying land that has since been completely carried away from this erosion. And so he then goes on to mention how this area is now completely gone. So they then go on and discuss some other property owners, some other farmers in the area. But this is something that's a big concern. And the man they were interviewing in that one bit has been there since that second facility I mentioned, that Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station, has begun its operation. So a lot of the landowners are certain that this is what's causing the increase in the erosion. And so I'm not going to do that. So discussing that Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station, we can't really pinpoint it as closely as we did with the Vernon Dam, where we saw that very obvious, the water's flowing there, this is sculpting away. This is a little bit more of a complex situation, because as I mentioned when we were discussing those two facilities, those two reservoirs, the water gets pulled down when it's pumping up, and it gets greatly increased when it's pumping down. And so along this whole reach, it's never having a stable water depth. So the banks can never really settle. There's been efforts to put trees along there, riprap around there, and this rising and lowering of the water just cuts right through it. And so here's just some of our topo maps. We're kind of referencing the ones that we're going to be using in the study. But the whole reach between Vernon Dam and about 15 miles south, Northfield Mountain, we're really going to be studying the banks of these. And so our primary focus on this is to develop if the banks have changed since the arrival of the Vernon Dam, and we're going to be using 1898 topo maps. And if that's any different between once the Northfield Mountain Storage Station arrived. And we're also going to try to find a way to see if we can say, have these hydro facilities increased these bank failures like the farmers and residents of the area have been so certain as what they've seen. And so a brief overview of the type of GIS methods that we're going to be using in this study include creating DEMs, digitizing the channel's boundaries, performing some image differencing to get a metric on how the landscape has changed, and calculate volumetric change between those 3 time periods. And that's what the Connecticut River Conservancy is the most interested to say or see. They're like, give us some volumes. So that's what we're hoping to get. So as I mentioned earlier, there's no such thing as DEMs from the year 1898 or the year 1960. And so we're going to be using these historical topo maps, understanding that they may not be as accurate as now, to give us a general idea of the location of the river and what the banks looked like at that time. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to start with a raster to vector tool in GIS, and hopefully that'll do a lot of heavy lifting, but we're not putting a lot of faith in that. So it may be just having to hand digitize some of these topo contours and just along the banks, not along the whole landscape like these images I have here. We're going to be digitizing them to just understand what was the nature of the banks during these first 2 time periods. And then there are tools in ArcGIS where you can go from contour lines to a digital elevation model. So we'll be creating historical digital elevation models along the riverbanks for these 2 periods. I say 2 because we luckily have some high quality 1 meter LiDAR data that we can use from 2015 to consider that, I guess, modern enough. So once we have these DEMs, these digital elevation models, we'll be able to digitize the channel boundaries for those whole 15 miles from these 3 time periods. So this image here shows from a study that I referenced a lot doing my background research by DeRose and Basher. And what they did is they were able to create a DEM for the year 1958. They used historical imagery in their case. And they were able to map out and digitize the channel's shape and location in each of their study times. And they were able to identify areas that accreted, which means sediment was deposited, or areas where it was eroded or where sediment was removed. And so we plan on doing a similar practice to that for our 3 different time periods. And then in the same study, they did some image differencing between those digital elevation models. So they took these interpolated elevations and they were able to see if the elevation increased, which would be an area that was accreting or gaining elevation, or if they decreased. So you can see these darker colors are these positive numbers. That's where elevation has increased. And you can notice that's at the inside of that bend of that river, which is where you'd expect the point bar to be. And then the lighter white colors are places that have eroded because they have lost elevation you would expect from erosion. So we'll be doing a similar process with that by just using the basic raster calculations to determine how elevation has changed between those 3 time periods. And then when it comes, like I mentioned, the Connecticut River Conservancy wanted some numbers for some volumes. It's just the basic what you'd expect from a volume, height times width times depth. And the way that this works is I used that example from that study I showed earlier. The width of this would be the lateral elevation between the times. So that 40 feet that I said the bank has migrated. The length of that would be just the length of the river bend that was impacted. And then the depth would be the general elevation change between the river and the top of the bank. So the top of the bank is here, the river's there. You take a quick glance, that's probably about 100 feet for the bank depth right there. So we would use 100 for that height, we'd use 40 for that width, and then however long this is for that length. And we could simply multiply that. And you might be saying, are we doing this for the whole entire river? No, we will just be doing this for areas where we kind of had these overlaps of change. So areas that have accreted or eroded, those are the ones that we'll be focusing on. We'll map separate polygons to identify these areas that we need to keep an eye on. And so our hypothesized outcomes for this, we're going to find bank failure. It's known. We just want to know where. we're hoping to confirm increased erosion downstream from the Vernon Dam, which again, from a visual glance, you can say yes, but we want to know exactly where and how much. And we're hypothesizing that this erosion has been amplified by the functions of the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Station, or that uprooting from any bank stability of having a stable water depth. And then we're going to be comparing those 3 polygon sets to kind of understand where and how these banks have been impacted. And that's kind of where we're at. So I'm definitely open for any questions that anyone might have. I actually have,
Oh,
sorry,
go ahead.
what? I was
No,
gonna
go
say,
ahead.
I have some deeper notes, but I'm like, I don't want to get too technical here, so.
Very interesting presentation, Lindsay.
Thank you.
So if anyone has questions for Lindsay, you can go ahead and put them in the chat window or raise your hand and we'll get to them. One question I had, or I was thinking about, is the sort of ongoing climate issue with the massive loss of hydrologic potential in the West. I know that the East Coast doesn't necessarily experience or isn't experienced that to the extent that it is in the West, but historically, are there any notable drought conditions that the Connecticut River experienced that could have impacted the change of your erosion conditions?
That's actually a really interesting point that I'm actually writing it down for, because I'm going to be doing the paper option for this project. So there have been a lot of droughts. I live in New England, so it's pretty obvious for me. The past summers have been very dry. So I'm not sure what kind of impact that may have on this, but that's definitely something to consider. We've had lots of droughts, and then these past 2 or 3 years, we've had a lot of extreme rain events. So things have been pretty weird here. We had Superstorm Sandy. We just had a hurricane that came through here. So it's kind of very unsteady. So that's definitely something I'll keep an eye open on when I'm kind of getting more to the discussion section of this study.
All right.
I don't know
Looks
if
like
that answered your question or not.
well, I mean, you're one of the points you were raising is this idea of the net collapsing, right?
Yep.
And these extreme events, be it a drought or hurricane, could potentially exacerbate or prevent that kind of net collapse. And then,
Right.
So
Yeah.
I didn't know, looking forward, because that's kind of what you're looking at,
Right.
is predicting, what impact would these major events have on sort of the duration of keeping the river as it is versus what potentially could happen in the worst case scenario, having that net collapse, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's great to think about, because we actually had a major hurricane here that's been studied by a lot of geomorphologists, such as myself. Hurricane Irene caused countless landslides in this area. So it's definitely something to consider for furthering with this study, for sure.
All right. Yeah, you got some questions in the chat room.
Yes. Okay, let's see this chat. Okay, gotta scroll up a little bit. Have I considered automating any of the study area locations? That's actually a great idea. That's something that would interest me a lot. I'm big on automation. I do a lot of programming with my day job. So I do know, so in my first master's, I don't want to get too deep into it. I was calculating stream power around every 100 feet of the stream reach, which this is kind of like a similar but different study to my first master's. And I used Python for that. And I think Python could be great for doing those kind of math calculations. So I think using automation is an excellent thing to think about. I'm just taking some notes because things have an excellent chance of flying in one ear and out the other for me. Okay, have I considered or seen any studies that determine error estimates for the volumes? Yes, actually the two of the studies I referenced, the DeRose and Basher and the Speakerman paper, both of them go pretty in depth with some of those kind of error considerations. Yeah, so I do have a bit of kind of a bit of that already under my belt to understand that. And that's definitely something we'll be applying here, especially understanding how we'll just be doing a proxy for that very historical topo data. Okay, I think that's all we have for questions in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions? This stuff's very interesting to me. I'm very excited I was able to use my interest in rivers. I've been wanting to study rivers since I was a little kid. So of course I'll do my second master's on it.
Well, your enthusiasm definitely came across in your presentation. So great job.
Thank you.
Hey, Lindsay, is it okay if I jump in for a second?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. Let me see, let me pull up here. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what Fritz said and the inclusion of climate change. And there's all kinds of ideas that, we could do for statistics and everything. But one thing that I was thinking about was how complex that this study could be and how we've already kind of had to parse it down. And so just a little bit of background, I was wondering in a few minutes, Lindsay, if you could just tell everybody the additional opportunities that you have with mapping the erosion in the other dams, and also possibly with doing some of the remote sensing options for determining the erosion and the suspended sediments, and then obviously with the inclusion of climate change. So
yeah, so we actually had a lot that we kind of had to try to parse and find the most simple, straightforward story for this. Some of the background research we were looking at also used suspended sediment as kind of a proxy to understand where and how much erosion is occurring. We were starting to dive into using remote sensing and satellite imagery for understanding where erosion, how much erosion is occurring. There's a lot of studies in New Zealand that have done this. They have a whole database called SEDNet, NZ for New Zealand. So that was one thing we wanted to consider. I'm trying to think, there's so many other dams in the area. Connecticut River Conservancy would have me doing all 5 of those if they could. But this data can actually prove to be very useful for them. Over the coming next few months, they're going to be having open discussions with the public. And this is something that they've always took a lot of pride into. And if you continue to watch that video I started to share, which I can post the link to that, it talks about how, they understand the policies very well and they respect the use of renewable energy very well. So it's an interesting project to be part of. I was afraid it was going to be kind of politicized and like, oh, hydro facilities bad, and they would use my data for that. But it seems like they really just want to understand and I guess work with the river, but also work with renewable resources. We also were talking about, so my former advisor when I was an undergrad has a drone license. He was like, oh, can I get some aerial imagery for you guys of that neck to understand that? So there are just so many different potential pieces to this project. We were like, this could be a PhD if we took it the full route. I don't know, was there anything that you were thinking of, Brandy, that I was leaving out?
no, I just kind of wanted you to reiterate what could potentially be a very complex. And
yeah, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, so it is really exciting, and I'm gonna end there, but I think you did a wonderful job. Your presentation was fantastic.
Thank you very
Great
much.
job.
And I saw a request for that DeRose study. Yeah, I'll send that through to you. There's actually a couple of them. There's one that I was looking at that was just about those error calculations. That's all the paper was about. So I'll get those through the chat now once I get a chance to go through there. Anything else? Anybody?
Yeah, we're with using your study, were they hoping to be able to figure something out to abate that those two merging
The neck
tanks
that might
from
get cut
breaking
off.
through. Yeah,
Yeah, so it's interesting because the research that was done that I was showing some figures, they said that it's not significant erosion occurring in that area. And I thought it was interesting that they didn't even really do an analysis the way they did in that one spot that was right downstream of it. And I think they want it to not be a major concern, but I don't
just
think
looking
they're
at
looking.
just looking at the images you have, you can see that it's cut in considerably in like 50 years or so.
Yeah, so we're hoping that if we have some numbers don't lie. So that's what the River Conservancy really wants, is if I can see this between these 3 time periods, if it has changed that much, even between 1898 and 1960, I'm going to use 56 data set. I think it's a little clearer. Even between those two, if that is setting at a similar rate that it is now, which I think will be interesting because we can do some temporal analyses between these. If it moved 40 feet between 2003 and 2013, well, how many feet did it move between 1898 and 1956? And we can see if these rates of erosion have increased or decreased, at least approximately. So it's something that should be pretty interesting.
All right,
Sounds like
well,
a-
with that, let's go on to our next presenter. So up next, we have Charles Kruger. Charles, if you want to start sharing your screen. So Charles, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we need you to start sharing your screen if you can.
Thank you. I'm just having some issues with Zoom here. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Huh. Okay, I got the, trying to just figure out how to get my full screen going here. Okay, no. Can you see that?
Yeah. There you go. That's better. That's good. Yeah, that looks good.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, well, thanks everybody for tuning in. My name is Charles Kruger. I am a alum of Penn State. Graduated in 2017 and went to work for a small engineering firm in State College. So I'm a local, although I'm working remote. I've also worked for the university in their mobile geospatial systems lab through the forestry department, and I'll explain a little bit about that. Part of my analysis comes from some of the data that was collected by myself and others in the group. Actually, that was a couple years ago that happened, but it's interesting how I'm able to come back around full circle and use some of this data. So my advisor is Brian Eberesny, and my title is Survey Methods and Accuracy Assessment Comparison, Qualitative Analysis for Selecting an Appropriate Survey Method. And can everybody hear me okay? Just want to make sure before I.
Yeah, you're good. Keep going.
Okay, great. Thank you. So to start off, figured a good way to introduce my project would be just through going through the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, and we're going to get into how afterwards. So who is this project geared towards? Any individual or entity that may be new to surveying or contracting surveying work, who is looking for what kind of effort is required to satisfy job requirements, a city planner or public works employee who is drafting a FRP, and any individual who's researching options for an upcoming project that will require surveying. What will this study entail? What will we be studying? Well, the concentration of this project revolves around trying to determine which of the 3 common surveying methods is appropriate for various applications when assessing cost, efficiency, and accuracy. So these are the metrics that I thought were most interesting and deterministic. Where to study for means of this project, and just for my experience, what I've seen in the field, there's all kinds of environments, but mainly they fall into one of the 3 categories: urban, wooded, or rural. When? The time frame for this project will be now, utilizing current technology. It's available 2021 here. And the case study is a little bit different. We'll get into that in a minute. Why study it? With a technologically advanced industry where it is common to have multiple sophisticated methodologies being used simultaneously, it is essential to know what tools and technologies are available and to frequently assess their benefits and limitations. So that's the 5 W's. Getting into the types of technology that we selected, and then I selected the 3 types that were considered to evaluate were selected in attempts to represent a range of capabilities that require varying levels of experience, cost, and post-processing workflows. So the first is differential leveling. This is the old school station rod and going out and measuring vertical distances from a known elevation point to determine elevations of unknown points. Structure from motion is a photogrammetric technique for estimating 3-dimensional structures from 2-dimensional images. So, for example, the bottom corner here shows the just kind of, you don't need to use that many images, but I guess the theory is the more images you have, the more overlap you have, the better end result you're going to get when you're reconstructing the model. So in this case, and you can use structure from motion terrestrially. You can use it with just a point and shoot. Heck, you can even use it with your iPhone. And just load them into the software. But in this case, we're using a drone. You can see the mission in the top right that has the area and the grid that we collected. And then the bottom shows you the ortho mosaic that's created and the DEM that's created from the ortho. So structure for motion. And the final type of technology is LiDAR. I'm sure not everybody here is now familiar with LiDAR. It's an up and coming, has been up and coming technology developed for the military back in the 80s, and now it's being incorporated everywhere. And as it gets integrated into through economies of scale and everything else, through autonomous cars and whatnot, the price keeps coming down, and we're able to use it in ways that we weren't before. And I guess in the world of surveying, it's been kind of a standard for some time now. But this also can be used from a drone, but in this case, or from a aircraft, like a fixed wing. Depends on the type of sensor that you're flying, and bunch of different stuff. But in this case, we're looking at terrestrial LiDAR. Basically, it uses light. If any of you guys aren't familiar, it uses light and calculates through angles and time that it takes for the signal to exit, bounce back, and return to generate a three-dimensional model. And also, you can look at things like intensity, but we're actually probably for this we're not really interested in the intensity. But so those are the methods that we're going to be interested in examining for this study. So my project is kind of going to have two parts. There's a case study that's going to look at the types of technology, determine their accuracy, and verify their accuracy, and then where we will essentially use the accuracy control from this case study for the purposes of this project. That'll be used as our accuracy metric. So the case study was conducted here. Like I said, this was through the Mobile Geospatial Systems Group between 2018 and 2019 at the Black Walnut Grove, and that's right there on campus. If you're familiar with Penn State, it's that red area right here. And the data was collected using various control points and methodologies to include LiDAR, structure for motion, GPS, aerial LiDAR, and some others as well. Here's the study area. The green dots are the actual control points that we surveyed. And you can see the values that we got back. We were able to conduct a survey, and then with the different techniques, utilizing the same control point for each technique, we were able to determine the accuracy. So we measured, and you can see the errors here in this slide, taking a cross section and looking at the different errors that each technique or method produce. So we have a lot of data, and we have a lot of that we're excited to use for this. I'm excited to use for this, and essentially this will be what I'm using for my accuracy component of my analysis. So as I said in the beginning, we have accuracy, we have cost, and we have efficiency. So the accuracy that each method is capable of achieving is likely to be sufficient for most survey projects that I have experience working on. The question then becomes, for the study, becomes a study of efficiency and cost. So, as I say here, in the addition to the accuracy, efficiency, which is directly related, both directly and indirectly related to cost. To review the efficiency of each method, the following criteria will be assessed and ranked for each method: leveling, structure, function, LiDAR in each setting, rural, urban, and wooded. So we got size. Will the acreage of the project considerably affect the effort and the selection of survey method? Does the time frame in which to complete the job require consideration? Some techniques require more time than others. Obstructions. Does the project area have considerable obstructions that will need considered? Training requirements. Does the project area and method require any specific training? And as well as size of crew and safety. These are just a few, not a comprehensive list, but a few at this point that we are looking at, that I'm interested in looking at. So, so with consideration of these factors that affect efficiency, how will we decide which method to choose for our analysis? So I initially started, my initial idea for this project was some sort of a cost benefit analysis, which I guess inherently it is still, by definition, but because of the nature of this technology and the multiple types of efforts that are required for a successful mission, there's no way to accurately quantify the costs. Sorry for the typo there, across scale for things like level of experience, training, post-processing, etc. So these things aren't comparable one-to-one. And I just realized that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to try to assign a cost to these metrics. So realizing the limitations of accurate comparisons and the difficulty to assign weights to these criteria, the analysis approach is better presented as less quantitative and more qualitative data. Which brings me to a couple decision-making techniques that I'm considering, or that I was considering. Max-min, which is best of the worst. This method attempts to make decisions by selecting all options that maximizes the minimum payoff achievable. As all decisions have costs and benefits, and Maximin seeks the decision that yields the smallest loss. And the other method is status spicing, which is the good enough kind of method. This method attempts to make decisions with the goal of fulfilling some sort of acceptable minimum requirement, which, being that it's a minimum threshold, it probably isn't a good fit for this application very well. Essentially, the max and min, because of the nature that none of these are going to be perfect, they're all going to have their inherent drawbacks. The idea of looking at each combination of methodology or technique with each environment or type of environment to study, we are going to compare them, look at the results, and of the results, which inherently are the going to be the worst, because none of them will be perfect, we will select which one is the best of the worst. So that's why at this point I'm still determining the best method to use, and I anticipate that it's gonna change potentially. This isn't set in stone, but this point, I'm leaning towards a max min analysis with radar charts. So as you can see here, I will create a chart with some of the different metrics that I had mentioned earlier, mainly cost, size, training requirements, size of crew, time, etc., and rank these in a chart to determine degree to which that specific survey method is affected by each specific metric. They will be subcategorized as human factors and technology factors, so that we can see kind of at a glance where there are issues. Now these three down here are just kind of demos. I just made some demo slides, some demo figures here, so you can get the idea. But essentially, for each type, I would have the three methods for wooded, the three methods for rural, and the three methods for urban. And once I create those plots, I'll be able to see, not only will I be able to visualize it very nicely to identify where I see problems or where I see advantages, but it also will give us a score, if you will. So the scores will be tallied and assigned a ranking score that suggests the best recommended method for the job. Each of these three scenarios will be written about, basically just to determine which is the best. My discussion topics include surveying structure for motion baseline data, choosing which methods to review, which areas to study, how to choose data points, why the analysis type, as well as how to rate the score that goes into the radar plots and how to interpret the results of the radar plot, which some of this stuff is, as I said, still a work in progress. As we go ahead and kind of flesh out the analysis, I anticipate that it will likely evolve, and it might not be exactly. I'm actually just anticipating that there might be more that goes on, whether it's like a second pass, where, because I was already thinking about, a lot of these methods could potentially satisfy the requirements, but why would we choose one over the other? So anyways, these are my discussions topics, and that's it for me. Here's my references. And any questions?
All right, good job, Charles.
Thank you.
If anyone has any questions for Charles, they can put them in the chat. Looks like you've got a question already.
Let me see. Yeah, thank you everybody for the comments. Yeah, let me see. Yes. Oh. Never mind. I'm sorry. I guess that wasn't my comment that I saw here. Yeah, that's a good, Ryan. Thank you for your comment. Yes, that's a that's what I'm trying to figure out as far as how to factor these weights. Um, because you're right. That's a good point. Um, some of these metrics are more um, are more weighted. I mean, they carry more of an more of a consideration than others, and that's a good point. I don't really have an answer for that. But I guess to answer the first part of your question, yeah, in real world experience, I would say no, they probably don't carry the same weight. Like I said, because some things are just more important. For example, like the obstacles one, for example, that's something that's hard to get around. And if you're flying a drone, because I mean, I'm also a licensed pilot. It's something you have to be very cognizant of when you're flying. Obviously, you can't be going under canopy. You'll lose, not only will you lose GPS, but you run into risks of having an airstrike, hitting something, or yeah. But so, for example, obstacles is a big one. Size isn't as big of a concern, although you can imagine like having to do leveling across a 2-acre plot versus a 20-acre plot. I guess it would get it would become a factor. But 2 to 20 is one thing, but 2 to 8 to 10, not as big of a concern. So that's something I'm definitely going to have to consider, and I appreciate your comments for that. So thank you. And Jake, thank you for your question as well. For my end user, I really don't have an end user particularly in mind. Like I said, I work for an engineering firm, and I work on surveys. I'm part of a survey crew, so I'm going out, and it was just kind of a topic of interest for me. First of all, because the data was there. Like I said, I helped collect some of the data a couple years ago, a few years back, and then just being that's kind of my field now. That was really why I was interested in it, but I don't have any particular end user. But if you are looking like for somebody who's, like I said, writing like a request for proposal, if they're looking for, okay, we know that we're going to need a survey, some sort of a survey component, it is kind of like a show. Like they really don't know. They might know what accuracy they need, but they don't know what technology is available, or they might have heard of some of the names, but because I've looked around, I haven't seen any sort of cost benefit on any sort of surveying method. So that was why I picked this idea. So, but that's it for me. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a real quick question here, Charles. On your differential leveling technology, are you talking about a sort of modern total station, or something like a K&E 4-wheel transit of days of old?
No, we well, like I said, that part, that's a good question. The total leveling wasn't something I was part of. That was collected by the group. I helped out with flying the drone when we did the data collection when we ran the grid, but I wasn't part of the leveling. So, but that is documented, and I'll definitely that'll be part of my methodologies whenever I present, whenever I write it all up.
I was just curious because you can get pretty accurate results with you know the older style manual transits with differential leveling. So I was just curious if you knew, but no big deal. So next up, we have Jake.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead and start sharing your screen. It will be in good shape. All right, we see your screen. So whenever you're ready, you can take off.
Awesome. So yeah, my name is Jake, and Dr. Aaron Long is my advisor. And this proposal, so to speak, is for a case study using GIS to pre-position Civil Air Patrol or CAP assets for disaster relief mission needs. So CAP, or the Civil Air Patrol, is the Air Force Auxiliary. It's an all-volunteer force. It was originally created in 1941. It was to fill it was created a week before Pearl Harbor. It's meant to, it was to fill civil defense operational needs, because obviously all of our battle-ready gentlemen went off to war. So the missions have changed over the years. We don't go looking for U-boats anymore. So there's cadet programs, which are developing young leaders, aerospace education, which is self-explanatory, and an emergency services mission. Now, this case study in particular is more interested in the emergency services mission of CAP, but this isn't the emergency services that most people are familiar with, like EMS or fire department. This emergency services revolves around primarily missing aircraft, missing persons, and disaster relief. There's two other notable missions, which are counter-drug and homeland security, but for the purposes of this study, we'll stick to just the primary purposes. There are ground and air assets throughout the state. In this case, Maryland is going to be the case study area. Every state has what's called a wing. So Maryland is a wing, Pennsylvania is a wing, and so on, including Puerto Rico and DC. So that's the basis of who this is going to be for. So those ground and air assets that I mentioned, the ground assets are primarily CAP vans that you see here. It's a 12 pax van that most of us have seen before. The ground assets are a ground team, which is in the van, as well as typically an SUAS, or a small unmanned aircraft system, much like the ones that have been mentioned in some of the previous presentations. And a lot of these missions, so to speak, for disaster relief operations are revolved around passing out needed material to citizens, which can range from food and water to ice and sandbags. CAP is, like I said, all volunteers, so it's very cost effective to ensure that those guys are out there and able to do their mission. The primary, other than the direct resource handing out, is their aerial photography mission, or AP as it's referred to. This can be done on the ground by personnel with provided equipment, cameras, and so on, or using the SUAS to get aerial photography of certain structures and other areas of interest as deemed by the mission commanders and the planners. Now, this aerial photography is a unique capability that a lot of other organizations don't have. They don't collect this information on a large scale and then send it out to the planners and to the decision makers, like CAP has been able to do over the years. And on the top right, you see the air asset. That's a Cessna 182. There's two different air assets that CAP uses in Maryland, but they all generally have a pilot and then more personnel on the right seat and the back seat that have more cameras taking more photos. And these are some of the most important photos in American history, recent history, I should say, have been taken from these aircraft. First aerial photos of 9/11 were taken from CAP aircraft, and a lot of the massive levee damages were documented using CAP aircraft. Like I said, Maryland's going to be the area of study. One, it's close, so I'm able to get access to this information a little bit easier. Its associated airports, waterways, and roadways are going to be used to develop en route times, and as well as help determine what a likely safe pre-positioned locations. And the whole reason why it's based on Maryland alone is because not all states are the same. This is poses some unique challenges, and it's limiting the scope so as to not overcomplicate what is part of more like a crawl, walk, run approach. And as such, there's going to be some growing pains, I'm sure. So as far as data is concerned, there's thankfully a lot of it is open source. Well, say all of it is really open source. The people here have been fortunate enough to be very forthcoming with information, making it easier to help pull some of the data together for the study. A lot of the CAP asset location data is actually available online to anybody who wants to look it up. It's your CAP situational awareness tool, which is the picture that you see on the right. It's for the whole United States. And as you get closer to some of the more populated areas, there's more assets that can be used. The red, orange, and green aircraft that you see, that's the current state. The current state that you see right here is likely what's going to be used in the study. Aircraft are never 100%. If you've ever owned an airplane, it's always in for its inspection. And there's a variety of reasons why aircraft or even vehicles, vans can be down. And as such, you kind of just need to pick one and go with it. And there's no time like the present. So the storm surge data, which is going to be where areas of high flooding, is provided by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. NOAA has a long track history of incredibly accurate and is very reputable with the way they collect and disseminate their data. Again, open source, making it easier to disseminate as needed. Hurricane tracks and attributes are also being provided by NOAA. Again, just more open source information, trying to keep it as easy as possible moving forward. And if anyone's worked in the classified field, you know how hard it is to declassify information. So I'm trying to keep it as easy as possible. While none of CAP's missions are classified, some of the information about operational could affect operational security. The roadway data, which is going to be used for calculating that en route time to get from asset home location to area of need, is going to be used using Google Maps, which may seem like a cop-out. However, if you keep in mind, a ground team leader is going to use tools at his disposal, which are likely going to be a cell phone and the Google Maps app. So it's most likely going to provide the most one-to-one data possible. And as for any Maryland specific data, the officials that I'm working with are, like I said, are very open. And it depends on a case-by-case basis, but already they've given me some information as to how they would expect to operate had a hurricane come through, which is what the study is about. The study is a case study about a hurricane, a simulated hurricane. And based on that, as well as some other information, it's going to be a kind of a compare, and we're going to see if there's a more efficient way to have them relocate their resources. And this data is going to be using hurricanes for the past 20 years. Based on conversations with the CAP personnel, it sounds like if you go past 20 years, the current state of equipment and assets is not going to line up quite right. Anything beyond 20 years, and you're kind of pushing the limit of what would be more of a one-to-one study. Okay, here's an example of some of the storm surge data I was talking about. This is for a Category 3 national storm. Again, all open source, and you can see the red is much higher levels of storm surge along the Atlantic coast. It's very apparent, and then even inside the Chesapeake Bay right there, you had a lot of orange and red. And this storm surge data can affect not just areas, it can not only indicate areas of need, but possibly areas that CAP personnel and assets can't be pre-positioned because they're susceptible to flooding. In fact, I know of a couple airports that are right close to sea level, and no one wants to use a boat on an airport. Okay, moving on to workflow. So the first part of this is going to be the data collection. which has already kind of started, but it's the collection of all the points used throughout the study, mostly the CAP air asset locations, ground asset locations, public airports. Some of the airports that are in Maryland are not necessarily going to be viable for some private airports are not going to be viable use. So we're going to stick to public use only, which obviously cuts down the field quite a bit. Hurricane track refinement, which is going to be taking basically the average of the hurricanes over the past 20 years and generating a track, and that's going to be the storm for the study. The storm surge buffer using provided data are going to be the areas of interest, and these are going to be areas of, okay, we know there's going to be flooding, and if there's going to be flooding, there's going to be people in need. And any areas of flooding have historically needed more, or there's been more requests for CAP to go out there and get photos and get eyes on, like I said, to give the mission planners in the back room a better idea of where they need to send resources. And the infrastructure data for possible mission tasking by state and federal agencies. What this means is what basically showing in these storm surge areas what infrastructure is going to need to get looked at. Now, are we really worried about the 50-year-old cabin that no one's touched for 10 years? Not really, no. It's more of the dams, hospitals, any sort of water treatment plants and things of that sort, or bridges in particular. Bridges are always a frequently used one. And understanding where we're likely going to be called, where they can position close enough to keep their people safe, yet remain responsive. I mean, this is an all volunteer agency, so it's unfair to expect people to drop everything they're doing and go away from their families and their own homes, which may have been just devastated by these storms, to go away for 24 to 48 hours. Once all the data has been collected, we have a good base map set up. We're going to go into one of the three scenarios. All three of these will get built out. And the first one is likely the easiest. It's no pre-positioning, so all assets are sheltered in place. So wherever the assets are now, if there was a massive nor'easter that comes through and the commanders for CAP in Maryland didn't have enough time to react, they would issue a shelter in place, and that's based on where those assets are located currently, is where those response times are what scenario one's tables are going to look like. Scenario two is their current pre-positioning. If CAP did have enough time to pre-position aircraft using information that they have given me already, seeing what those response times would be. So ideally a little bit faster than had they just sheltered in place. However, it's worth noting that as they shelter in place, they're not necessarily safe. And their current plan of repositioning is designed for maximum protection. You want to protect your assets as much as possible, air and ground. And then scenario three is more of the refined pre-positioning, so to speak, where it tries to find the sweet spot between close to the areas of need for faster response, but also away enough from the danger zone as to not put personnel or material at risk. And then the results comparison is really we're just going to see, okay, what are the results, right? As far as who's fast and how can we maximize the amount of time or minimize the amount of time it takes for CAP units to respond to areas of need. And these are federal, FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Maryland Emergency Management Agency needs, like I said, based on historic need, talking to CAP and where they've been tasked previously. And other things to consider are variables regarding routes for ground and air assets. Like I said, if an airport is flooded, it's of no use. And if it was not planned for, then there could be a lack of capability in some areas of the state. And if anyone's been through a hurricane, you'll know that roads get closed all the time for flooding and debris. So it's another thing to keep in mind. Tabulated data, it's going to be fairly monotonous. It's going to be a unit A to point A in time and so on. And there should be some trends that start to show between the first and second and third scenarios, hopefully which we can draw conclusions from. Some disaster relief areas of interest, like I said before, between the storm surge areas and historic areas of need or for infrastructure. Those are obviously something to consider. And I already talked about some of the airport and unit locations. Now, a whole separate thing for the air assets in particular is the fact that Maryland is obviously physically located close to DC. If anyone's flown near DC in general aviation aircraft, you have to stay well clear of the SFRA and the freeze. And that's a special flight rules area in the flight restricted zone. Those are areas that the FAA and the DoD and a bunch of agencies have said, to protect the Capitol, we don't want anyone flying in here. So while CAP has permission to fly in those areas, it takes a significant amount of preparation, or more preparation, I should say, to go out and execute missions in these areas. And Storm doesn't care about any flight restricted areas. So it's another thing to keep in mind. And ultimately, a final set of recommendations will be offered. It's designed to give tactical commanders options. So as of now, they only have one playbook, and this is designed to kind of give them an opportunity to, well, sir, you can, if you want a little bit safer, you can go here. If you want to kind of push your luck, you can go here. And all three of these scenarios are likely going to fall on something like this quad matrix you see. So we got asset response on the left, and asset safety on the bottom. The most safe is to the right, and then the most quick response is up to the top. So all these scenarios are likely going to fall somewhere in here, where one is more safe than the other. One is the most responsive, but may put assets at the most risk. And that's something that this study aims to look at. So like I said, we want to generate a general set of recommendations. We need to generate a general set of recommendations based on aspect response time, comparisons of three scenarios. Like I said, we're going to be able to see what those trends are as we start to tabulate a lot of that data. The intent is to improve response time for these assets. This is an all-volunteer organization who goes out there every year and conducts missions as needed by state and federal agencies. To make the most of this awesome asset, GIS has a very unique capability to help with them, as they're so centrally, their command structure is so centrally located after it's modeled after the U.S. Air Force. As far as timeline, starting now, I've already started some of the base map data collection and generation. The phase one is from basically now until December, finishing out the base map and completing scenario one. As I said, scenario one is likely the easiest to work with, as I already know where the assets are going to be. And at that point, we'll already know where the areas of interest or the infrastructure of interest are. Scenario two is the current playbook, so to speak, of what CAP has given me as to their current plan of action. And then scenario three is that refined playbook, so to speak, of and the final results recommendation. Again, it's not an end all be all. It's part of a crawl, walk, run. And there's going to likely be refinement and a significant amount of work that needs to be done until this would actually be implemented. But this is again, giving commanders options that they don't have currently. And then the final presentation revision up until presenting ideally in April. Some limitations, like I said before, it's meant to be a case study just for Maryland. It's just trying to get the CAP is working on incorporating more GIS. It's evolving with a lot of its technologies. SUAS is a great example of that. CAP wasn't even flying SUAS 3 or 4 years ago. And now they're able to do it on a national scale and have been deployed, quote unquote, deployed to other areas of the United States and Puerto Rico included to conduct these flights and take this aerial photography as a need. And FEMA has become more and more dependent on these AP missions or aerial photography missions. Is this AP asset only? This CAP asset study only. So it doesn't incorporate the EMS that I talked about earlier, the fire paramedics, the power line operators, which obviously is a big deal with electricity. And because of that, one would think that a study like this wouldn't be used for that use case, but things get lost in translation. Is a hurricane specific study. Again, every scenario is a little bit different. This is just generating an average to see, okay, based historically, looks like it's going this way. How can we best prepare for that scenario? And as I said before, it's an all volunteer organization. So some of the responding assets, there are some assumptions, basic assumptions that need to be made. And it impacts everybody differently. You saw on the storm surge map, all along the Atlantic coast, it was all red. Well, if there's any CEP members that need to get to aircraft and they're red, and they're areas of red, it's unlikely that you can rely on them. Not that they're not reliable, but simply that the areas that they live are likely going to have their own issues. And as any planner will know, no plan survives first contact. So we can make all the plans in the world, and real world comes in and makes your plans obsolete. And the other thing is this tasking is based on historic needs from FEMA. If FEMA or MEMA come up with these new needs that have previously never been known before, this whole study is going to need to be adapted because of that. Now, there's no way to predict the future. This is just a very good assumption, so to speak. And the thing with, because these are all volunteers and they're willing to work with me on some of this information, there is possibility of validating, quote unquote, some of these potential preposition locations using CAP has exercises every year. So it'd be neat to work with them to revise this, not just on a, oh, hey, let's try it one time, but an annual or biannual basis of, hey, how can we refine this? How can we get this a little bit better? You know, it's going to look like a bad hurricane season this year. We need to have a plan of action for that. Looks like we may have some odd winds this year. We need to plan accordingly for that, and so on. And obviously, there's a lot of factors that go into the Chesapeake Bay, and as some of those factors make themselves apparent over the next couple of years, GIS can be one of those tools that CEP can use to kind of help make it around the curve a little bit faster. And with that, I open it up to questions or comments.
Okay, thanks, Jake. Great job. If anyone has any questions for Jake, enter those into the chat window. Rob has his hand up. So Rob, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, hi, my name's Rob Williams. I'm actually a former Boeing guy and familiar with UAV operations. I think as I look at your study, one of the things, you know, because of the complexity of the groups that are using this information, I think you'd be well served to think of use this idea of personas, the key people in their key roles, and select one or two, and then select what are the one or two or three most important pieces of information they need. And that might help you narrow down and get your first your first generation product out.
Okay. Yeah, we've been learning about that recently, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question, Jake. It seems to me that an issue that is sort of overarching of all this is planning. You talked about that a lot in your discussion. And in this particular case with hurricanes, the planning comes from predictions from National Weather Service. So how does that prediction factor into the planning stage, and what role would that then have on planning for the asset allocation and timeliness to respond?
That's a good question. And currently, see, their playbook says, well, based on the prediction, we're going to do one of 5 things, let's say. And the commander at the time has to make that decision to go north, south, east, west, or other. And that is based solely on that weather service prediction, like you said. We're kind of cheating, so to speak, in this case, as it's simulated, because it's just using the average of the past 20 years, right? So we already kind of know where it's going to go. I kind of know where we can, I can kind of fill in the blanks a little bit sooner rather than in real time, which would require a lot more coordination for sure.
All right, thanks. Looks like Rob might have another question. Oh, okay, there he goes. Anyone else have a question for Jake?
I put a question in the chat. I'm curious if you have an idea for a method for calculating that average path. That's something that's really interesting to me.
There was I'm sorry, I can't read the questions. There is no, yes and no. During some of the reading, there was some interesting ways that it was looking at how the Weather Service predicts some of these predicts some of this, some of the ways these hurricanes go. And obviously we're all very familiar with the cones and where they're going to be located and at what strengths. It was going to be more of a make a polyline and work from there. But there's after reading a little bit more, I think there's going to be a little more complicated way to determine. I only keep using the word the average, but kind of finding a mix of not just cutting it down the middle, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, to me, it seems like there could probably be like, so my background is in geology, and a lot of times we try to find ways to like understand the average like strike, which is the trend of bedrock, which is a directional thing. So bedrock was not my background. As I mentioned in the others, I've done rivers, but it seems like there's some kind of way, I feel like there should be a way to find like an average direction. I mean, I know hurricanes don't go in a straight line, but I don't know. It's something that seems very interesting to me. There's probably got to be some kind of math, some kind of interesting math tool in GIS that could kind of figure that out.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely gonna have to dig some more into that as well.
All right, well, if that is all the questions, thank you again, Jake. Oh, looks like we might have one more. Oh, no, that was just a congratulations. So up next, Alan. You want to go ahead and start sharing your screen?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me all right? Just want to do a
yes.
quick comp check. All right. Awesome. Let's see. Make sure, is everybody getting this?
Yes.
Okay, let's see if I can get this going. All right. All right, well, good evening, everyone. I hope you've all been having a great Monday, or at least as good as Mondays can get. I'm Ellen Zoller, and I'll be briefing you all on a return to scud hunting with GIS. Just as a quick note, all the materials in this are unclassified, so no worries there. All right, so just to jump into this, here's a quick agenda of what we'll be going over as part of the proposal. A lot of the typical stuff we've seen tonight already. So I want to jump into this real quick as to why it matters. So the question being, like, why are we focused on a 30-year-old problem from the Gulf War, 1991, arguably resolved within a month from that really quick lightning war? And the answer to that is because the problem is still relevant today and even more relevant moving forward into the future. So a quick vignette I wanted to highlight here, as you see in the picture here, this is Al Assad Air Base from January of last year, or almost 2 years ago, actually now. And just a little bit of current events, or I guess history, that you could call this, is that what we did was we took out the General Soleimani, general in the Iranian Republic Army, and it resulted in some retaliation there, being the launch of several Fateh 110s, ballistic missiles from transporter-erected launchers. So these mobile TELs, as we call them, these mobile systems launched their missiles towards the airbase, and as you can see, they cratered, did some damage. Now, this is actually a bit of a success story because of the success being that our space-based assets were able to pick up and detect the missile launches and then transmit that warning down to our Joint Tactical Group station. We call them JTAGs. We were able to transmit that down to the JTAGs, and they were able to disseminate the warning to these troops, these soldiers and airmen, and they had about 3 minutes to move to bunkers before impact. So success, but to a varying degree, because 3 minutes is not a lot of time. And where this gets into why it matters is because the future of these systems they're becoming more robust. If you're able to look into the Russians and the Chinese as they develop their capabilities with these mobile missile launchers, these TELs, and their payloads. If you haven't heard of the hypersonic glide vehicles, I urge you to take a quick look online. It's some scary stuff. It's very fast, very agile, very maneuverable warheads that are able to kind of dodge and weave through air defense systems, so currently right now there is no match. So really post-launch, after the launch, we're still working to see what we can do to stop this kind of these kind of munitions making their way across the battlefield and impacting. So the best that we can do right now with current technology is try to get left of launch or ahead of these missiles, and that's where GIS can come in. And that's where this kind of weaves into the project or the capstone proposal. So moving into the objectives. So like I mentioned, the problem is that current early missile warning technology focuses on post-launch detection and warning for ballistic missile threats, which results in us having significantly decreased time, having to wait for that launch to get the detection. So I have a little animation here to kind of paint that picture. So here we have our satellite, or we'll call it our space-based infrared SIBRs. And there's our area of operations that we have painted down below. Actually, are you able to see the mouse? I just want to double check.
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so this is our area of operations. We'll say we'll call it Iran, for instance. And the way that the current architecture works is that there's a launch detected, and then we send out the signal. The warning makes it down to the JTAGs group. They disseminate the warning to the affected areas, and folks run into the bunkers. So the question being, how could GIS be injected into the early missile warning architecture to aid in predicting launch locations, ultimately getting left of this launch, giving us more time to react and respond accordingly. So getting left of the launch, the proposal here then is that we have the objectives to gain an understanding of previous attempts to use GIS analysis. It has been done before in a limited aspect to predict these tele-launch locations, as well as synthesize methods with those of similar studies under the lens of scud hunting during the Gulf War for the development of a new modern prediction tool. And once again, there's another animation here to kind of illustrate this. Same scenario, we have our satellite, we have our area of operations, again, we'll call it Iran. But this time we've used GIS to assist us in finding these locations of where these prime locations where they would set up ahead of time. So that way we have this narrowed down, this isolated view of where we want to look and where we can predict them to go. And then here's the illustration here. The TEL arrives on the site, we get the cue. We're already putting the warning out there saying, hey, something's about to happen. They're going to fire, start pushing out that warning across the theater. And then by the time the launch comes out, folks are prepared and we're already tracking this. Or in another scenario, if we're able to throw out some offensive counter air to prevent the launch altogether, that's an option too. So that's kind of the idea of getting left of launch. The end state of this is to have a final product that is an effective tool to model specific TELs, physical parameters and employment in a designated AO, identifying ideal launch locations for improved warning via surveillance and engagement. So that's the aim of this proposal. So to toss out a brief history lesson, just to kind of get everybody spun up on the Gulf War, which is going to be our scenario or test bed timeline here, considering the historical data present. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights just to get everybody fresh on this topic. So 2 August, Iraq invaded Kuwait, which prompted the Americans to assemble in Saudi Arabia. On the 29th of November, we gave them an ultimatum to withdraw by 15 January. Well, 15 January rolled around and they did not withdraw. So on the 17th, the Gulf War began with coalition air campaigns targeting Iraqi infrastructure, communications equipment, air defenses, missile systems, and such. On the 18th of January, Iraq fired its first volley of Scud missiles on Israel and Saudi Arabia, initiating the Great Scud Hunt, which was a problem that we did not take too seriously ahead of time, as intelligence had predicted. Yes, we know that they have these Scuds, but they did not foresee them as being the challenge that they were to destroy. So continuing it on, 24 February, we began a ground offensive, so roughly 1 month of coalition air campaign against them. And then within a day, 25th, they fired a Scud missile, destroying a barracks in Saudi Arabia, killing 28 and wounding nearly 100, showing that we still didn't have the threat contained. And then on the 28th, they accepted UN resolutions and brought a close to combat operations. So that's a brief history lesson, a brief refresher. So in particular, what we're looking at is the Scud hunting aspect, of course. So efforts during the Gulf War were primarily air patrols and air strikes, is very traditional Air Force methodology for dealing with problems. So in particular here, they would fly out there, they would search wide areas trying to find these Scuds, looking through the desert and thousands of feet up, trying to spot these little dots on the ground that look like missile launchers, trying to find, identify, and then destroy them. And it wasn't very effective. There was a lot of terrain to cover, and the Iraqis were very well trained as far as their crews went in hiding their systems to prevent detection from these aircraft. So another system that we had in place was for detection and targeting was the DSP, the Defense Support Program, which was a satellite constellation of overhead persistent infrared. And it was there to detect intense heat plumes. So when rockets fire up during their boost phase, they're able to pick up that intense heat, and that's where they can kind of ping, hey, there's a launch right here, and we'll try to target them based off of that. So those were the efforts that we had and the capabilities we had during the Gulf War. After the Gulf War, we recognized these shortfalls that we had in countering mobile missile launchers, and started working towards fixing this or addressing these, which we had Project Stalker and Tiger. And Project Stalker was a GIS application where they attempted to find the Scuds, but instead of aiming for left of launch, it was more right of launch, where the idea was that they would receive like the launch data. Hey, it launched right here. You would feed it into the system, and then it would kind of give you a prediction of where it might be going afterwards to try to get to like a hideaway spot. And then hopefully you'll have something, an air asset in the area to try to intercept that. So that's kind of where it was going. And then it got rolled into Tiger, which was a separate, like a programming suite of different tools. And it got rolled into that. And eventually Tiger just kind of faded out of I don't want to say out of existence, but into obscurity. And that could either have been from increased classification, maybe more things got added and it bumped up in classification, and then as far as the public eye knew of it, just couldn't see it anymore, couldn't find it. Or Tiger faded away around 2001, which during 9/11 happened during that year, and we shifted from large-scale combat operations into a COIN environment of counterinsurgency, and the threat there didn't necessarily have the tells of the mobile missile launchers, so it kind of got on the fell to the back burner as opposed to that. So, and then of course they upgraded the space-based early missile warning architecture. That's a SBIRS, as I mentioned earlier. It's like an upgraded version of DSP, so it's a bit more effective, a bit more robust, and capable. So, moving on, we'll spend a little bit of time on similar studies from the Lit Review. Big focus is on using GIS as an auger. The key takeaways that I pulled from this that kind of inspired everything else going on is having the necessity to have good samples of known locations of the phenomenon, the correct variables that explain presence and absence, and the ability to create those variables. So those are key. And those were demonstrated in a few other studies, such as the urban growth of Charleston, where they really demonstrate their adept identification and creation of variables from their good sample collections that they did. And then they also tackled it with a few different approaches there. And their train models yielded highly accurate predictions, with the logistical regression being about 97% accurate, but it withered over time. GIS for crime analysis, this was in Lisbon, not as good of a case as Charleston's, where they had smaller, less accurate sample data and fewer variables, and the model that was yielded was just less accurate and had some limited effectiveness to it. So it kind of displayed the importance of these three key factors from using GIS as an auger. So moving on, the proposed methodology here is the suitability model workflow, and this is, as you can see, the example is pulled from Esri. And we'll go into this in a little more detail in the next slide, but essentially the workflow being that you define the problem, you establish some base criteria, and you extrapolate the important data from that, transform it into some, the way I phrase it is kind of like putting it into ones and zeros as far as what you need and what you don't, and then weight it, combine it, and then that gives you the locations that meet all those criteria that you're looking for. And then analyze kind of feeds in afterwards. You don't see it in this example graphic, but it's like validating that the results, and then kind of going back and tweaking it is how I'm going to be using this going forward. So on the next slide, this is the model that I'm proposing here for determining these TEL or SCUD-B launch locations, in particular for the Gulf War data set or the problem set. So we're trying to define TEL emplacement in general, and the SCUD situation is kind of a case study, so to speak. So, so what I did here is I established some base criteria, 3 different submodels of terrain, physical parameters, and tactics, with terrain being the elevation, land use, and water features. Physical parameters as the footprint, the spatial footprint of the system itself, the gradient for it, missile range and aspect, or the orientation of it, and then tactics as the view shed, minimum safe distance, roads, and time. And then the data that I'm trying to extrapolate from that will be the slope from the elevation, from the land use, it'll become the population centers, the road systems, the infrastructure in place, and then water features of the river, which all we have to worry about is the Euphrates, fortunately. And then physical parameters for the footprint, that becomes the dimensions, length, width, height, and all that, the weight of the system, and for gradient, that translates into the max slope. The TEL range as well, as far as where it can travel and distance, cruising distance, and so on. So gradient is that max slope the system can handle without a rollover. And missile range, of course, stays the same. Missile range got to be in the range of the target. And then aspect is it needs to, that orientation where it needs to kind of face the direction of the target for the systems at the time, of course. So tactics, view shed becomes visibility, cover, and concealment, which the Iraqis were phenomenal at what they were doing with the cover and concealment in their hideaway spots, which we were not prepared for during the Gulf War. And that's where a lot of the coalition struggles came in, trying to identify like where they were going or where they were hidden, and being able to take these systems offline. The minimum safe distance becomes a safety buffer for personnel safety, of course, and infrastructure, just making sure they're not damaging anything or causing casualties. Roads become routes, and the time is linked to telemobility, and that's the temporal aspect of it, of being able to get out to site, fire a missile, and get back or get to your hideaway spot. And it's kind of a timing and distance related there. And we'll go into that with the characteristics with the speed, but survivability is really kind of a key word for that. Just making sure it can get where it needs to go before a jet is scrambled and finds it on the way there. So all this data is then transformed into each one being a layer, get it coded, those zeros and ones, weight those, and that'll be kind of a more qualitative aspect, is trying, and a lot of trial and error. They're trying to work through the importance of each one, the criticality of each one, each aspect, and then combining those layers into one to yield the predicted launch locations of what locations might be suitable for those Scud-Bs to launch from during this window. And of course, analyze comes into this, where I will be validating the data, the results of this, doing spot checks to make sure that it makes sense and then going through tweaking and trying to adjust to really refine the data into something that makes sense. So that's the suitability model that I'm looking at. Some of the key characteristics going through, I'll point out a few. For that telemobility, that survivability, maximum road speed, 55 kilometers per hour. That's about 34 miles per hour. Very slow. Actually, I will step back just a moment here. The Scud B that we're talking about during the Gulf War was the modified Al Hussein variant. So the Iraqis made some modifications here. They cut the payload in half by weight, and they used that to add more fuel so that way they can extend the range. And that was during the Iran-Iraq wars, so that way they could range Tehran. And then ultimately, they modified all of their Scud Bs except for 5, and that's what we saw during the Gulf War. So we're dealing with a modified variant here. So returning to some of the important data here, the maximum gradient, that slope that it can handle, 30%. We have our parameters, basic parameters, length, width, height. Moving into the missile component data, we have some launch times here, as well as time into action, 1 hour from a pre-surveyed site. So again, that mobility aspect of 1 hour to be able to get out there, fire your missile, and assumedly 1 hour to return or less to get to a hideaway spot if they've identified one that is suitable. So again, we're dealing with short time windows, so we'll get to some assumptions there to kind of flesh that out. Propellant liquid, this is something that I haven't quite, a data set that I haven't teased out just yet, that I've been working on, or at least thinking over, with the fact that liquid fuel for the propellant for these missiles is very cold. So if there's some sort of way to pull out like an IR sort of analysis of that, just looking over imagery, trying to see if we could spot like extremely cold spots on the map, like that might be a tip off of the fuelers or something like that, where their missile support systems are. And of course, where the support systems are is where the Scuds are going to be. So that's a little detail that I'm trying to tease out, and it may or may not make the final cut. Then of course, working down the rest of the way, we have the weight and the minimum safe distance, 300 meters, which is about average, is what we use for most of our systems, just to make sure things are safe in the surrounding area. So building the sandbox here, we have our Scud launch areas. They're primarily the west and the south. We're going to focus on the south. And what I've done here is I've built a map using, based off the area of interest here around Al Basra, that southern launch area. And I built it with imagery from December 28th, 1990, so just before the war kicked off, and some elevation data from the shuttle missions in 2000, so as close as I could get. And what I've done is painted a picture of the major highways, the major roadways, the supply routes, roads that are likely capable of holding such a heavy machine. And then also highlighted the population centers, some logistics centers with those airports, and then some symbology for the support systems in the AO, and of course the Scuds themselves. So this is the test bed that I'll be running a lot of my methodology and models against. So moving into this is the Gulf War Air Power Survey Scud strike map. As you can see, it's not a very detailed map, but this is the closest that I've gotten to confirmed targeted locations or strikes on those Scuds. So this is kind of the validation product that I'll have for the time being, unless I can find some more refined data. And just to point out the western area, the reason why we're not going with that one is that most of the strikes, as you can see, are along the roads. And what we can infer from that is that the strikes occurred on those Scuds when they were in transit, not necessarily on a site they were using. So the southern section has a much better area for us to take a look at that and try to confirm. So some of the assumptions I'll point out, the key ones being road related. So the Scuds have to maintain a degree of proximity to their supporting infrastructure. The Scuds have to move quickly to their hideaway spots and back their support areas to avoid airstrikes and retaliation. Given they have low top speeds at 34 miles per hour, they likely did short distance hops on the roads to compensate. So that way they can make it to their locations faster. And then of course the preponderance of shots were made overnight. So they're likely tethered to roads for navigation, expedited movement. So the inferred thing here is that the roads are going to play a huge factor in trying to determine where they were going within their short times that they were able to, or within their low top speed, how far they could get out and use those locations. So it's going to be critical for the analysis. Limitations, the dated imagery and elevation data that we're working with is 30 years old or 20 years old for the elevation data, 30-meter resolution. So those are some limitations. And then there's the course coalition strike location data. There's low confidence in that accuracy from the research that I've done. There's not a lot saying that those strikes were very successful. So there's some concerns there. Mitigations, outreach via the NGA for that refined launch data. And so we have one note out there for that to see if we can get anything out to further this. And then of course the application of the model under modern imagery, trying to do a comparison under maybe some Landsat 8 data or something like that with additional bands. So then of course we'll do a quick analysis to make sure there's nothing unusual between the two. Of course, like the city will grow, so I'll be paying attention to those details if I take that route. So anticipated results, ideal specific solution with about 1 square kilometer of error, reasonably close enough for a pilot to search without dedicating too many resources. And acceptable would be about 5 square kilometers, a little bit bigger, a little more resources, but not terrible. We're not trying to search an entire country as we did with the Gulf War. So project timeline, we're mostly down through here. We're just starting to test the model and refine it, and then we'll be working towards that completion in April with the written report and the presentation. And with that, are there any questions?
All right, Alan, great job.
Thank you.
If anyone has
References.
questions for Alan, go ahead and enter them in the chat window. While we're waiting, I have a question that maybe you could address. So you brought up a very interesting point in that the launch vehicles relied upon roads to get them from their hiding places to a viable launch pad. How are you going to define a road in your area of study?
For the roads, what I'm looking into is potentially like making a buffer essentially around them. So mapping out like those MSRs, ASRs that I had on the map over here. Taking those and adding a quick buffer around them, just an expected, I don't want to say radius, well, I guess radius would work, distance from the road that they would be able to maneuver to, because they're not likely to fire from directly on the road, but they're likely to pull just off the road. And I would say maybe like 200 meters at most, depending on the terrain, of course, what can handle their system. But pulling just off the road, maybe a 200-meter buffer and seeing where that goes. That's kind of how I'm anticipating to work with those, because it is going to be large. So most of like their launch areas will be just off the road, and then I think the rest of the criteria will be able to eliminate, via slope or water features or what have you, be able to remove that excess area where it wouldn't be able to go. So it would kind of refine to just the areas off the road, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and these are all wheeled and not tracked vehicles?
They're all wheeled, sir, yes.
Yeah. So that would obviously limit where they could or couldn't go compared to a tracked vehicle. Soabsolutely.
And with the weight, one of the challenges, additional challenges that I'm just kind of mulling over in my mind is the soil, the ability of the soil to hold, something that is like 44,000 kilograms, just a very heavy system. And, they're definitely not looking to get stuck out there. That would definitely defeat their purpose of trying to get out there, launch something and escape, keep with their equipment intact. So right. That's just something else that I'm kind of mulling over on the side as well. making sure that they don't get stuck in some of these areas. So that goes with like the analyze phase, where I'm just kind of spot checking the validity of the model.
Okay, all right. Thanks. Looks like you got a question in the chat window.
Okay. Let's see here. Let's see, from MBM. Historical data to analyze and predict possible future events. How are you correcting to avoid curve fitting? That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that too much just yet, so I'll definitely take that as a note, and definitely take that into consideration to make sure that I do avoid curve fitting. So I appreciate the tip off. Thank you there. I'm just gonna jot that down real quick. And from C. Kruger, Charles, developing the model. What's your workflow for the model and development? So the model itself, I'm looking to just keeping it basic as far as like using the model builder with ArcGIS, the Pro desktop version. Just using the model builder to kind of work through that process, and it's probably going to be some trial and error as far as like working through the individual criteria. But I feel like working through it that way kind of gives me more control over the variables, and being able to pull out like being able to extrapolate like what's working and what isn't working, and then trying to fix those individual problems. As there are certainly other methods for trying to build a suitability model. I've seen, signature analysts, GeoPlanner, things like that, or the running like a Bayesian model and such. But the first approach that I'll take to this is trying to work through that manually and understand the variables, be able to create them, and then making sure that they work. That's kind of the initial steps, at least. See what I can generate with that. And the third option, the third results option is maybe it's worse than 5 kilometers squared. And, at that point, I might need to look at some of these other models that are out there to refine the problem, or refine the solutions here to the problem. So that's kind of where I'm looking at this point, or my frame of mind. Are there any other questions? Or
Well, thanks again, Alan, for a great presentation. Very interesting.
thank you.
Up next, we have Patrice. So Patrice, okay, we see your screen, looks good.
Hello.
We can hear you. So yeah, go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. Okay. So my project is based off of how many firefighters do we need, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more here. So to start off, we're going to start off discussing the project, the data I'm going to use, the analysis, and the overall outcome that I hope to achieve from this project. So, why the question, where this need came from. A little background for me: I am a volunteer firefighter in Jackson Fire District 3. That's the career side of it. I'm a volunteer. Currently, there are an understaffed paid fire department. They don't have enough members to adequately staff the paid fire department from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So understaffed in this project means that the fire department that was responding during the day with only three firefighters per apparatus, which per the NFP standard 1710, each fire apparatus should be staffed with at least 4 firefighters. Why 4 firefighters? The basics of this is that you need someone to drive the fire truck, you need someone to tell everyone what to do, and you need at least 2 firefighters in the back, one to control the nozzle and one to back up the nozzle. That's just the basics. Like you need at least 4 to function adequately. If you lose that 4th person, if they're out sick that day, or you just don't have a 4th person for your crew, you only have a staff of 3, the officer usually has to drop down and be the backup to the nozzle, and be in the position of telling everyone what to do while also being inside fighting the fire. Depending on the house fire or the situation, it's always better to have at least 4 people per the NFPA standard. So with that, I describe here, Jackson Fire District number 3. The population of Jackson Township Fire District 3 in 2010 was 23,970. And in 2020, the population grew to 24,875, which is a 4% increase. During those 10 years, the district only hired 2 new firefighters, resulting in their staffing changing from 11 to 13. And that push to hire the 2 new firefighters was like an ongoing push. It wasn't an easy ask from the town and the commissioners. And there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of, there's no money there to hire firefighters. The town doesn't want to vote on the budget for the fire department because they don't believe they should have their taxes raised. And there's a lot of different aspects that go into it. And ultimately, leaves towns with understaffed fire responses that the people of the town don't necessarily always realize. If you're at home, and you have your oven catches on fire and you call 911, usually, most times, I believe, I hope in everyone's situation, the fire department comes out, they help you out, and then everyone goes home. And you don't necessarily always know if, those firefighters are volunteer or paid. They're just someone coming to help you in your time of need. There's situations in certain towns where there's fire calls that come out and there's no one there to respond. And it takes, dispatch out a fire department, no one can respond, or the career staff is already busy taking on another call somewhere else and they don't have the resources to send a truck to the second call. So they have to wait for like mutual aid, which is a neighboring town, to come in and respond in to help out these people. So if it's an emergency, which any call can be an emergency, it could be like a 10 to 20 minute ETA to get someone there to help out, which isn't, good. There should be adequate people there to respond. So as I went on that, the firefighters for Jackson Fire District number 3 responding crews of 4 out of 2 stations, and the new station was built in 1973. So out of all of that means that there's 8 firefighters on staff from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. daily out of the 13, with only 5 to spare in the situation that, a firefighter takes a day off or gets, injured. From 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. calls are answered by the volunteer firefighters. So that's how Jackson Township works for their fire response. In comparison, the neighboring town, Lakewood Township, in 2010 had a population of 92,843, and in 2020 the population grew to 158 people, which was an increase of 46%. So Lakewood has grown immensely in 10 years, and it's only going to continue growing with more and more people and more buildings being built, and it's a constantly growing and evolving town. So in that time, Lakewood Fire District number 1 hired 16 new firefighters, which doubled their career firefighting department size to 32 from 16. They just finished hiring the last few firefighters a few months ago to finish out what they had said in the beginning of, I think, 2010, to hire 16 new firefighters within the span of those years. So these firefighters work a different schedule. They work 24/72s, which means that they work a 24-hour shift and they're off for 72 hours. So their staffing is a little different. It's a little bit easier on their career firefighters in that aspect because they don't have to, they work one day and then they're off for 3 days. They have more time off and they have more time to plan vacations and stuff at that time. They don't have to take days off as much as Jackson would, where they work a schedule of, they're in the station from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. 3 or 4 days a week. So Lakewood Township has 7 firehouses located throughout the town. Out of those 7, the 8 career firefighters that are on duty during the day respond out of the 2 stations for 24 hours. And then volunteer firefighters respond whenever they can. And that goes for both fire departments. During the day, at night, whenever volunteers are available, they'll respond, but there's no guarantee that you will have a volunteer firefighter respond because they are volunteers. They have jobs and other requirements. They're not dedicated to be in a place to respond for a certain amount of time during the day. So with that, Jackson Fire District number 3 has 13 firefighters for the population of 24,000, and Lakewood Fire District 1 has 32 firefighters for the population of 135,000. So it takes about 10 to 20 firefighters to safely fight a house fire, and that fact alone says that Jackson Fire District number 3 doesn't have enough firefighters, in Lakewood as well, during a day to adequately fight a house fire on their own. If it was just that one department responding to that house fire, they have mutual aid come to help out. But with that, they don't have enough people on staff right there and then to go and fight a house fire. And along with that, if you have your entire career staff out of one station fighting a house fire, after that, if it's at 6 in the morning and they're fighting a fire for until 9 a.m., they're going to be exhausted after that, and they're going to have to still work their shift. They don't have, in Jackson Fire District 3 at least, they don't have people who will come in and relieve them and take them off. So they are exhausted at the day, and they might make mistakes later on in the day, and because they're tired and exhausted from the morning. So something else to take into consideration about the numbers. And along with that, if Jackson Fire District number 3 has a structure fire, the entire career staff that's dedicated to that fire, they can't leave to go respond to another call because they're dedicated to that fire. So if there's a fire alarm or CO alarm, anything, even EMS calls, they have to rely on mutual aid to come in and respond to those other secondary calls that happen in that time. And along with that, since Jackson and Lakewood are neighboring towns, if Jackson or if Lakewood has a structure fire, Jackson Township Fire District number 3 is a rapid intervention team called a RIT team. It consists of 4 firefighters, and that would mean that they have to leave their fire district or their current area to go stage at the structure fire in Lakewood to be the RIT team there. And the RIT team is basically a team that is dedicated to rescuing firefighters. If something bad happens, they have to go in and save somebody. So that would mean that they would, leave the town with one less, engine to respond because of that. And so with all of that information, the rates per NFPA of career firefighters per 1,000 people protected are ranged like 1.54 to 1.81. So that's, a firefighter and a half to almost 2 firefighters per 1,000 people in a town. So with those numbers and all the statistics, that means that Jackson should really have almost 37 firefighters, and Lakewood should really almost have 208 firefighters compared to the numbers they currently have. So kind of, there's extremes there. Lakewood currently only has 32 firefighters when this standard is saying that they should have 208 firefighters, which is a huge increase. Jackson is also another, huge increase, but not as drastic as Lakewood is. I included charts here to kind of like visualize this a little bit better. That Jackson Fire District, this is like their current staffing and the expected staffing, just how, insane that is, along with Lakewood Fire District number 1, which is an even bigger gap because of that number. And comparing the 2 towns together and the differences there, and just what this standard is saying that the town should have to protect them adequately. And along with that, the NFPA standard 1142 states that fire station response area should be 1.5 road miles from the station. So that means that that's the response area from each station is 1.5 road miles. And another aspect of my project is possibly looking at this and seeing if population fire stations, if there's a correlation there, and if fire station locations and population matter if their relation to each other is a meaningful relation. So the data going to be used is the, I have the fire district number 3, that's the boundary of the town, population census data, road data, and then we're going to collect fire station data for comparable cities, around 80 to 100 cities, to kind of potentially create a new formula or analysis to see what a standard should be, like an accurate standard or a standard that makes sense, and to see if the current one truly does make sense. So the analysis, going to compare and use neighboring towns to compare growth in fire protection services. Going to create a formula, or the current formula supplied by the NFPA does not take into account area size. It only takes into account people per firefighter. So we're going to use area to help judge how many firefighters should be per square mile, like that population area. And with all that, there's going to be a regression analysis on that to basically decide, does population affect fire protection services, along with, does area and population affect fire protection services. So the ultimate goal of my project is to create a new formula that accounts for population and area to get a kind of better standard, and to see if the current standard makes sense for how many firefighters should be in a town. So the outcome, I kind of want to hope to see that if Jackson Township Fire District number 3 needs more fire protection services, using this analysis that we hope to create. And with that, the analysis that shows where people, or where possible new firehouses should be built, or how many more firefighters are needed for an area, and to predict the number of firefighters needed based on population, and possibly predict the number of fire stations based on population. So hope to have both these goals. We're gonna work with them both and see what the outcomes we get from the analysis are. It should be, the ultimate goal, like I've said a few times, is to create a new formula to see if population and area affect the number of firefighters for an area, and if that number matches what the current suspected standard is for an area. And with that, that's my presentation, and if you have any questions or suggestions or anything, please ask them. There's my resources.
All right, great job, Patrice. Anyone has any questions for Patrice? Go ahead and put them in the chat window. So kind of you have a question already.
Okay. Some locations, the affected area that can be covered in time. Yes, so I would like to take into account, the road conditions, weather, geography, along, I like to take into account with that, and the data that I have, the road data, includes some of that information. Along with that, I also would like to take into account like the types of buildings involved there. So to see, like, if there's apartment buildings and if that affects that number as well. But that's definitely something I can look into. And with traffic information out there as well during certain times of the day, I can also affect response times as well. So that's a good point. Thank you.
I have a real quick question. When you were talking about population, I assume, are you referring to like population density, or just raw numbers, or how does your conception of population fit into the modeling process?
As of right now, I am using just raw population numbers. But the analysis might evolve into using population density depending on how things go.
I wasn't sure how Lakewood or Jackson were actually building. Do you have like high-rise living buildings, or so those were some of the ideas I had with regards to density.
Yeah, another one of the questions that came in was the businesses that serve the area, like chemical plants and explosives. And Jackson is more of a residential area that has some commercial buildings, but the biggest building is 2 stories tall. It's a lot of senior citizen living, which also brings another aspect into it, is, you know, the different calls that you get from that, having that in your response area. But Lakewood has your high rises. They have a chemical plant, they have their commercial areas. They have a lot more in a lot smaller area than Jackson has, depending on like high risk response buildings and stuff like that. I can include predicted population growth for the analysis. That should be something that's can be easily done once the analysis is done, to kind of, you know, and it's using previous census data to kind of expand on and see what the trends may be for the future, and then use that as a planning tool. You know, so you can be like, well, this area would possibly need this many firefighters in this amount of years to help the town plan out how much money they need to have in that time frame. The Air Force Base that is not far from Jackson, Joint Base, that doesn't really have too much of an impact, because they're the section of Jackson I'm looking on is more towards the it's not as close to the base, it's kind of further away. The town of Jackson as a whole, you know, there's the Cassville section is closer to that, but even then it's not too much of a issue because they have their own fire department on base, and they don't necessarily always come off base to help, and we don't necessarily always go on base because of the military rules and stuff like that. But with that, the Air Force Base could potentially cause hazards to the area. None have happened yet, and hopefully none do happen, to at least the Lakewood, Jackson area, at least recently. But with that, you know, you could bring in your hazmat and your other specialties that you don't necessarily need in certain areas right now, and you have other towns to bring those into this area, but could potentially be something that's needed in the future. With evolving technology to help limit the number of firefighters required in the future. Possibly, it really depends. It depends on a ton of different things. There's, with the Internet of Things and having all like our devices be connected and having all this technology that allows, you know, our smoke detectors to just speak to the dispatch center right away, are really helpful in getting quick responses, and also like just having technology there for us. But along with that, with growing technologies, a lot of things are built cheaper, especially houses. They aren't built the same way like they were years ago. Now they're built quickly with the cheapest materials possible and put up really fast. So that means that they burn a lot quicker because of the chemicals used and the, you know, synthetics that are put in houses and stuff. Like there's a lot. Houses burn quicker now than they did before. It doesn't necessarily affect the number of firefighters required for it, but it would affect having the firefighters there to respond in time and not have to wait for volunteer firefighters to come and respond to the station and hope that there's enough there to respond to a house fire. So yeah, hopefully I answered those questions. Good.
All right, what does anyone have other questions for Patrice? I like to remember at the beginning of the chat window or the top of the chat window is the peer review form that the presenters should pay attention to and fill out for the presentations. Seeing no other questions for Patrice, I want to thank all of our presenters for doing a great job We look forward to seeing your final presentations in 596B or your presentation venue, wherever that may take you. So we will bid you a fine evening, and we will see you back here tomorrow for another round of 596A presentations. Good night.